All right, so we're going to spend some time talking about the lymphatic system. First, what we'll do is we'll start with the functions of the lymphatic system. So the first function is that it transports escaped fluids back into the blood. So, transports escaped fluid back into the blood. And so what this means is that when we have the blood flow, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail, but as we have the blood flowing through all of our blood vessels, we have an exchange. So we have fluid leaving the blood vessels and going into the tissues. This is called interstitial fluid. So once we have the fluid moving from the blood vessels and going via osmosis into the tissue area, then it's called interstitial fluid. And then interstitial fluid, or tissue fluid, can build up in the tissues if we don't get it out of the tissues, because it'll just keep going from areas of higher concentration, which would be in the blood with the blood plasma, to areas of lower concentration in the tissues. So then we would continuously be putting tissue in there until, of course, it equals out, but we don't want our tissues to be as fluidy and liquidy as our bloodstream. So we need to take that fluid from the tissues, from the interstitial fluid region, and get it back into the bloodstream. And so we get it back into the bloodstream by putting it in at the subclavian veins. Remember, those are at the base of the neck, up by our clavicle, hence the name. Sub, below, and then clavicle, subclavian veins. So that's the first function, is to get this fluid back into the bloodstream. And then the second would be to play a role in body defense and resistance. So body defense and resistance. So we have these things called lymph nodes that we'll look at in more detail, but the lymph nodes are going to filter the fluid. So filter the fluid, which is called lymph. So it's going to be filtering the lymph, and it's going to be taking things out like cellular debris and take out pathogens like bacteria and viruses and other types of organisms, as well as cancer cells. So it's going to be filtering through the fluid. It's going to filter out all of these things. So not only is it going to filter these things and get rid of them, but it also contains leukocytes. And our leukocytes are part of our immune system, and we're going to talk about that more in the immune system, but our leukocytes are important for immunity. So these are immune system cells that are going to identify pathogens, and it's going to label them for destruction, or send up a little flag saying, hey, this is what the bad guy looks like. And in fact, the lymphatic system is named for the large number of leukocytes that are called lymphocytes. So they're actually specifically lymphocytes. So that's how we have a defense and resistance, building up this resistance. We have a lot of leukocytes, we have these lymph nodes and other types of features in the lymph system that are going to try to help to defend the body, try to get rid of pathogens and cellular debris and cancer cells. And then the third function, the third and last function, is to transport lipids. And we're transporting lipids from the small intestine. So when we eat food, we are breaking down all of these various items in the stomach and breaking them down in the small intestine. And toward the end of the small intestine, we're going to start absorbing these things. Lipids are a little bit different. We don't absorb them the same way that we absorb hydrophilic items like glucose and our ions and things like that. And so we actually transport lipids from the small intestine area, and then the lipids are going to go into the lymphatic system. And then we transport them up to our subclavian veins, where the lymphatic system dumps into. And that is going to get it into the bloodstream rather than going from the small intestine into the bloodstream. Instead, we're going from the small intestine into the lymphatic system, and then the lipids are going to be transported through the lymphatic system and then dumped into the bloodstream. All right, so those are the three functions of the lymphatic system. Now let's take a look at the different structures of the lymphatic system. All right, so the lymphatic system consists basically of two semi-independent parts plus lymph fluid. So the two semi-independent parts are, first we have the lymphatic vessels. So the lymphatic vessels are similar to blood vessels. They are similar to blood vessels. So as we have our blood vessels throughout the body, we have our lymphatic vessels throughout the body. So they're structurally similar. Basically, there are lots of tubes that are going throughout the body, and we have smaller tubes, like we have smaller capillaries of blood vessels, and then we have larger tubes, like we have the aorta, which is a larger blood vessel. So we have some larger lymphatic vessels and some smaller lymphatic vessels. And then the second of the semi-independent parts are the lymphoid tissues and organs. Lymphoid tissues and organs. And we're going to talk about the different types of lymphoid tissues that we have in the body. And then we're also going to talk about the different types of organs that are considered to be part of the lymphatic system. Before we do that, though, let's take a look at this lymph, the lymph fluid. So lymph, again, is excess fluid that is carried by lymphatic vessels. And that's why it's called lymph, right? So it's the fluid that's in the lymphatic vessels. And then once it gets up to the subclavian veins, where it dumps into, then it would just be part of the blood plasma. But while it's in the lymphatic system, it's called lymph. It is composed mainly of water. So it's composed of interstitial fluid. I guess I can, right? Composed of the interstitial fluid, which is mostly water. So again, we have the fluid that's moving from the blood vessels into the tissue, and then when it moves into the tissue, that's now called interstitial fluid, which is all around the tissues. And that's mostly composed of water. It's also composed of, or lymph is also composed of some metabolic wastes. So metabolic wastes meaning things that we would see other places like urea, things that are filtered out in the blood, lactic acid, things like that. And then some other substances. So minimal amounts of things like ions and things that would get into the lymphatic vessels and the lymph. So this is really similar in composition to blood plasma, but it does not have as many proteins. So remember, our blood plasma has a lot of different types of proteins in it, namely albumin, and we don't see that albumin in the lymphatic vessels or in the lymph. We could see some very small proteins that would be part of these other substances that might kind of get caught up in the mix and get into the lymph, but it is very similar to blood plasma with the exception of the high amounts of proteins. So then, when the blood reaches the capillaries, as we said, blood reaches the capillaries, those smallest vessels, the fluid is going to be pressed out of the blood. So let's see, the blood reaches the capillaries. And then what happens is we have this difference in high amount of fluid inside of the blood vessels, and then a lower amount of fluid on the outside of the blood vessels. And so it is not only is it going to go via osmosis, just naturally, we also have pressure. Right? We have blood pressure, and our blood pressure, the pressure inside of our blood vessels, is going to be much higher than the pressure that's inside of our cells. So we have pressure. So the blood is going to reach the capillaries, so via osmosis and via the blood pressure, the fluid is going to be pressed out. So the fluid moves out of blood vessels, as we said, and then it goes into the tissue spaces, so into the tissue spaces. And of course, now we call this interstitial fluid. So then once we get to the tissue spaces, then that interstitial fluid is going to be pressed into our lymphatic vessels. And then that's when we call it lymph, because now it's in our lymphatic vessels. So we're going to take a look at how it is that it's going to get into, how it gets pressed into the lymphatic vessels. So we already know that the blood vessels, we have this high pressure of the blood, and then the osmosis, it moves into the tissues. Now let's take a look at how it is that it's going to be getting into the lymphatic vessels, because we say that it gets pressed in there. What that means is, if we take a look at our capillaries, right, so we've got our main capillary here, and then we're going to go into kind of a rough drawing of a capillary bed here. Do a quick drawing of a capillary bed. And I'm going to attempt to show that it's changing into deoxygenated blood here. All right, so let's just pretend this is our capillary bed here. And what this means, what I'm trying to illustrate here, is that we have our blood flow coming in here. Right, so our oxygenated blood is going into the capillary bed here. And then it's going along the capillaries here. And then as it's doing this, this is where we see this exchange of nutrients and wastes. And since we see an exchange of nutrients and wastes, what we're doing is we are getting rid of the oxygen going into the tissues. And what we're doing is we are picking up our carbon dioxide. And then as we move further here, that's why it's blue, now we're getting into deoxygenated blood that's going into the veins. And that's because we have so much carbon dioxide moving in over on this end of the capillary bed. And over here, this is where we see most of our oxygen leaving. So now as this exchange is occurring, not only with oxygen and carbon dioxide, but with other nutrients, at the same time we have lymphatic vessels. So we have lymphatic vessels similar to the way that we have other vessels. So these are kind of winding around on top of and moving in between. I'm trying to show that they're going behind the blood vessels here as well as in front of the blood vessels. Because really what we have is lymphatic vessels that are over and around all of the capillary beds. So our lymphatic vessels in front of and behind. Now we have some more lymphatic vessels here. Let's say it's going in front of and behind here. So these are lymphatic vessels, and so we have lymphatic vessels kind of spidering all over the capillary beds and all over the body, really. But I'm just showing the capillary beds here because this is where we're going to have the exchange. So here we have our blood flow. Our blood is flowing again in this direction, and as it's going through the capillary beds, we have this exchange. Now we have this exchange in both areas here. So here we have the oxygen is moving out, the carbon dioxide is moving in, but at the same time we have a higher pressure in our red side, right, our oxygenated side of the capillary bed compared to our deoxygenated side. And that's because we see fluid in the yellow here. Let's say yellow is H2O. So we have fluid moving out into the tissues here. So fluid moving out of the bloodstream, getting into the tissues. And that's because of our high blood pressure and because of osmosis. There's less fluid, oops, that's the wrong way, less fluid, less water in the tissues or in between the tissues than there is in the actual bloodstream. And so we have all of this fluid moving out. Now when we have this fluid moving out, it's moving into the tissues called interstitial spaces, and so interstitial fluid. And then when this happens, now we have this high amount of water in these spaces. And so then just like we saw the movement out of the blood vessels, we can see the movement of this water. There's a higher amount of water in the tissues and a lower amount of water in the lymphatic vessels. And so then we see the movement of water going into the lymphatic vessels, just like we saw it moving out of the blood vessels because of the pressure. Now we have a high pressure in the tissues because we have lots and lots of fluid in the tissues. Now that we have lots of fluid in the tissues, that's a higher pressure than in the lymphatic vessels, which is a lower pressure. So then we're pushing the fluid into those lymphatic vessels. And that's because of the difference in pressure. So we have empty vessels, we move the tissue in, or move the fluid in, and then we have a higher pressure in the lymphatic vessels than we have in the tissues once we've moved a lot of the fluid from the tissues into the lymphatic vessels. And then the lymph is going to move through the lymphatic vessels and then keep this area, keep the capillary beds kind of low in lymph fluid in the lymph vessels, so that then when the fluid is moving from the bloodstream into the tissues, then it moves from the tissues into the lymphatic vessels. And that's how we get our lymph fluid. Now, we wouldn't, if we didn't have this process, if we didn't have the lymphatic vessels, then this interstitial fluid would just build up in the tissues, right? It would leave the bloodstream, because of the blood pressure, even if via osmosis it wouldn't move out, via the blood pressure it would move more and more fluid out into the tissues. And so moving more and more fluid out into the tissues, if we didn't have the lymphatic system to kind of pick up that fluid and get it out of there, then we would have a buildup. A buildup of fluid is called edema. So a buildup of interstitial fluid. Buildup of interstitial fluid. And when someone has edema, that's just excess water, excess fluid in the tissues. If it is related to ineffective lymph system or lymph vessels, then it's called lymphedema. Now, it can be related to some other things as well, but if it's due to lymph vessels that are not working appropriately, then it's lymphedema. But if we have appropriately useful lymphatic vessels, then it shouldn't be a problem and we won't have this buildup. Now let's take a closer look at these capillaries here, these lymphatic capillaries. So they are called that. They're called lymph capillaries. And they are where we find our blood vessel capillaries. So just as we saw up here, we have our lymphatic capillaries up here. So the tissue, as well as the large chunks of lipids that are going to be moving from the small intestine into the into lymphatic vessels, get into the lymphatic vessels in a little bit different way than we see in the bloodstream. So our lymphatic capillaries, let's look at the structure of those. And we actually have the walls are going to overlap to form flaps. So the walls overlap to form flap-like mini valves. So let's do a quick drawing of that. So if we took, up here in this other illustration, if we took a lymphatic vessel, right, and we just drew a close-up of that lymph capillary, what we would see, these are cells here, is that they have overlapping walls. So that's another cell at the top here, and then so these are the little flaps that make up a lymphatic vessel. And then these little flaps have little filaments that are going to anchor them to the tissue here. So these are anchored, our lymphatic vessels are anchored by little tiny filaments that are going to hold them in the tissues, hold them still as these things are moving. But I'm going to use yellow again for water, just because we established that up here. So remember that this is our lymph vessel right here, or we'll say lymph capillary. Now remember we had our water out here. So when we have our water out here, this is our interstitial fluid here, our excess fluid in the tissues because the blood has come along and it's pushed it out. So then what happens is this fluid is going to be high in pressure, and it's going to push its way in between these flaps. So it's actually going to push on these flaps. Now there's a higher amount of fluid, a higher amount of water on the outside of the lymphatic tissues, the lymphatic capillaries, sorry, then there is water inside the capillaries. So there's not much fluid inside the capillary, much lymph. And so when we have this high pressure, it's going to be pushing against the tissue here. It's going to be pushing against the vessels. And when it does that, it's going to push these flaps open. So these flaps are going to open up into the vessel, and then the fluid is going to be able to flow into the vessel. And then let's say this flap here is going to open up as well, and then the fluid is going to be able to go into the vessel. Now when there's a high amount of fluid in here, because this has been happening, right, all of these flaps are opening, and now we've increased the amount of fluid in the vessel, then what happens is there's such a high amount of pressure in here that's going to force these flaps closed. And so we see the flaps are going to go right up against each other again. So moving the flap from down here to up here now, and same thing, the flap will go from there to back up here. So we'll see the flap is going to close now. And then that will stop more fluid from moving into the lymph vessel. But then, of course, the lymph is going to be moving. It actually moves from the capillaries. It's going to be forced up toward the heart, right, up toward those subclavian veins. And then that's going to decrease the pressure. So the lymph would be moving this direction if this is the end of a lymph vessel. So the lymph would be moving this direction, and then that's going to decrease the pressure in the lymphatic capillary, which then is going to mean that the interstitial fluid has a higher pressure, and then we see the process again. So push those flaps open, the fluid is going to go into the lymphatic capillaries, and then there will be a higher pressure of fluid inside the capillaries than outside, so it closes the flaps, and then it forces the fluid through the lymphatic system. That decreases the pressure because we have decreased fluid now, and then we have an increased fluid outside that'll open the flaps, and then it keeps going. So the walls are going to overlap to form these flap-like mini valves, and then the fluid leaks in. And then the higher pressure, so the higher pressure inside closes the valves, as we said, pushes them back. And then the fluid is forced along the vessel. So now let's talk about that next step in the process. So how does the fluid leave the vessel? Our lymphatic system, our lymphatic vessels, are not a closed loop like we saw with the bloodstream or the blood vessels. And that's why you saw my illustration here. I drew an ending to this lymphatic capillary. And that's because there are endings to the lymphatic capillaries, which means that our lymph is going to be moving in this direction in these capillaries in order to move along the lymphatic system. And then, of course, that means we have a decreased pressure in that area, which allows us to get more lymph. So our lymphatic vessels, let's just say our lymphatic vessels, and we'll talk a bit more about those. So our lymph is going to move toward the heart, as we already mentioned, moves toward the heart. And that's because we're moving it up to those subclavian veins. Now, the heart does not pump lymph through the lymphatic vessels. So the heart pumps the blood, but there is no pump for the lymphatic vessels. So there's no pump in the lymph system. So how do we get the lymph all the way back up to the heart? So think, we have lymphatic vessels, lymph capillaries, all the way in our toes, all the way in our fingers. So how are we going to get this up to the heart? Well, one way that we do it is through skeletal muscle movement. So similar to the veins, our skeletal muscle is going to help pull blood back up toward the heart. So when we move our muscles, that's good for our body because we're going to be moving that fluid back up to the heart so that it's not going to start pooling in any areas of the body and cause edema. Another way are respiratory movements. So the pressure in our thoracic cavity, due to respiratory movements, are going to create pressure, increase pressure and then decrease pressure in our lymphatic vessels. So that's going to start kind of sucking up the lymphatic system. So same way our skeletal muscles move, they're going to squeeze the lymph vessels and then relax them and squeeze them and relax them. Same thing with our respiratory movements or the pressure in our thoracic cavity. It's going to squeeze and then release and squeeze and then release. We also have one-way valves, similar to what we saw in our blood vessels, in our veins. So we make sure that the lymph goes in one direction. So we have a similar type of vessel where it's going to kind of have flaps going in, and then the vessel continues going here. And so then when our lymphatic fluid is going, it's going to be going up this way. Then it'll push these flaps. The flaps will go up against the side of the vessel here because we have all of this fluid coming up. So these will flap open and push up against the side of the lymph vessel, allowing space for this fluid to go through. And that would be, say, because of a skeletal muscle movement. We have our skeletal muscle over here that we've somehow squished this vessel. And in squishing the vessel, we've forced fluid in this direction, forcing these flaps open. But then, when we relax that skeletal muscle, these flaps are going to go back down. And then when they go back down, then it's going to allow that fluid to then settle up in this area without actually going back down the vessel. So we have these one-way valves to make sure that the lymph keeps going in the up direction, up toward the heart. Unless we're up above the heart or the subclavian veins, then we're helping it to go down from the head. And mostly that's going to be useful or done by gravity. So all the lymph is going to flow toward the subclavian veins near the heart, and that's where the lymph is going to re-enter the circulatory system and then become blood plasma. So blood plasma. So then that's where it ends. It ends being lymph and it goes into being blood plasma. So unlike, again, the cardiovascular system, it's not a closed loop, it's an open system. It's not a closed system, it's an open system. We have an end to it, here at the end of these lymphatic capillaries, and then or a start, I guess, a start to it, and then an end when it goes into the subclavian veins. So now let's take a look at those other structures. So we said we had various lymphatic structures and then other organs. The first lymphatic structure we're going to look at is the lymph node. So the lymph node is a bean-shaped structure. And the way that this works, it's actually found in the lymphatic vessels. So we have our lymphatic vessels going up, and then what we have is we have this kind of bean-shaped structure. I'm actually going to draw several lymph vessels going into the structure here. So kind of bean-shaped structure, and then we have lymph vessels that are leaving. So this right here is going to be the lymph node. And the direction that we have things moving is this direction. So we have the lymph moving up into the lymph node as it's moving up toward those subclavian veins, and then it's going to leave through these vessels here. And so we have a lot of fluid going into the lymph node, and what's going to happen is we have lots and lots and lots of these lymph nodes. We have smaller lymph nodes and we have larger lymph nodes. But as our lymph is moving into the lymph node, we have harmful materials will enter those lymph nodes from the lymph vessels. So again, we have this transference of the fluid, but then we also have other things like bacteria, viruses, cancer cells, other cell debris. So we can say harmful materials enter the lymph vessels. So things like, remember we said bacteria, viruses, cancer cells, and cell debris. So then our lymph node is going to filter the lymph for us. So filters the lymph. try to get rid of all of those different things. And this is also where we see our defense system, our defense part of the lymphatic system. So we have our defense cells within the lymph nodes. One type of defense cell we have are macrophages. So macrophages are going to engulf and destroy foreign substances. So our macrophages are going to be eating different things. So if we have bacteria in the lymph, then our macrophages will have little macrophage cells hanging out in here, so that if a little bacterium comes along in this lymph, going this direction in the lymph, then this bacteria can come along and it can, or the cell can come along and can gobble up that bacteria and get rid of it before the lymph keeps on moving out of the lymph node. So macrophages will engulf and then destroy different substances. And then we also have lymphocytes. And lymphocytes are going to provide an immune response to antigens. So what we see are, if we have bacteria, and we'll talk more about this in the immune system again, if we have a bacterium, our body recognizes that it's not something we want in the body, it's not one of our self cells, and since it's not one of our self cells, our body recognizes it because of this thing called an antigen on it, and then when it recognizes it, it actually can break it down, and it can present that antigen, that bad guy look, and then say to the rest of the body, this is a bad guy, this is what we want to go out and destroy. One of the things I want to mention about lymph nodes, if you look at my drawing of the lymph node, I actually have 3 vessels that are going into the lymph node and 2 coming out. And it's actually much more than 3 vessels that are coming in. It should be much more than that. So we have lots of lymph that's going in and then very little that's leaving. And this is on purpose. What we see is that we're gathering up lots of lymph from the tissues, and as we're going more and more and more and more closer to the subclavian veins, we're getting smaller and smaller in the number of vessels that we have. One, it makes sense that we'll end up with 1 lymphatic vessel going into the right subclavian vein, and then 1 lymphatic vessel dumping into the left subclavian vein. However, it's more than that. It's that we have more fluid going into the lymph node than we have leaving, which means that we're going to increase the pressure in here. So we have a high pressure situation in there, which means that we're going to be bringing lots and lots of fluid into the lymph node, and that fluid is going to spend some time in the lymph node before it leaves. So we kind of have this build-up space, and that's important because this is where we're doing the filtering. This is where we have our defense cells. So we make it so that the fluid is going to enter the lymph node, spend some time there before it leaves, because we only have 2 tubes coming out, but we'll have 6, 8 or so coming in. Meaning then we have a lot of fluid that's trying to get in there. It's going to spend some time before it's able to squeeze out of the vessels that are leaving the lymph node. All right, so now we're going to spend some time talking about those other lymphoid organs. So the first one that we are going to talk about is the spleen. So the spleen is located on the left side of the abdomen. And it helps to filter the blood, and it destroys worn out blood cells. So it plays a role in defense. So it filters the blood and destroys worn out blood cells. It also acts as a blood reservoir. So it's actually kind of a spongy tissue. It's very, very fragile. And so this is because it has lots of spaces to filter the blood. So it filters the blood. It also destroys blood cells that have been floating around for too long, ones that are worn out or maybe even damaged. And then it also helps to kind of be a sponge to hold on to the blood for a while, just as a reservoir. If there happens to be a cut or something, then we have plenty of blood hanging out in the spleen. Also, it contains a large amount of leukocytes, and so this is why it's considered part of the lymphatic system, because it has a lot of leukocytes, which means it's part of the lymphatic/immune system. All right, so that's pretty much it for the spleen. It does the similar function. It's going to target different bad guys, bacteria, viruses, cancer cells, and things, label them, and tell the immune system what they look like. The second lymphoid organ that we'll talk about is the thymus gland. So the thymus gland is located low in the thorax. It overlies the heart. So very close to the heart. So the thymus actually functions at peak levels only during childhood, and it actually loses function as we age. So most active in children. So it's most active in children and then decreases with age. And what this does is it actually produces hormones that programs our lymphocytes, so our white blood cells. And then this is actually ends up being the location for maturation of those T lymphocytes specifically. So it produces hormones to program lymphocytes. So this is part of our endocrine system, as was mentioned. And then this is the location for maturation of T lymphocytes. So when we talk about the immune system, we have specifically T lymphocytes. So our thymus gland is going to produce the hormones that are going to program our lymphocytes to make them do certain types of functions. And of course, this is why it's most active in children, because in children, as they're growing, they're interacting with all these different things in their environment. There's going to be lots of programming of our white blood cells, or of the white blood cells. But then as we get older, we've already kind of interacted with a lot of our surroundings, especially because we don't tend to move around all that much. We're kind of in similar areas most of our life, for the most part. And then we still have this as a location for the maturation of our T lymphocytes. So even if, as we're getting older, we're either moving around a lot in the world, so we're interacting with different things, or we're just interacting with different types of viruses that are coming about, or different bacteria that we're finding, then we still have this maturation and programming of the lymphocytes happening. It's just not as high in amount as when we were children. So the third lymphoid organ we're going to talk about is mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. And this is called MALT for short. So mucosa-associated, so associated with the mucosa, so we can think of mucosal layers, something like the digestive system or the respiratory system, the different tracts in the body that have mucosa. And then this is masses of lymphoid tissue that are associated with those areas. So basically we're saying there are patches of lymphatic tissue in the body that tends to be scattered and poorly organized. And so we see these again in the digestive tract, and the respiratory tract. Also, our tonsils are a type of MALT. and other, we can just say other small accumulations. So as I was just saying, we have kind of these chunks or different patches of lymphatic tissue. So similar to what we would find inside of the lymph node itself, what we see are kind of chunks or patches of this lymphoid tissue around the body. Just again as another layer of protection, since it's filled with these different types of white blood cells, so immune system cells. And so they're kind of scattered all over the body, poorly organized. They can appear and then disappear when needed. But we do tend to have some of this malt hanging out specifically in the digestive tract. That tends to stay there, as well as the respiratory tract. And then, of course, we have tonsils, which are a type of malt. So let's talk about tonsils specifically. So 4 are the tonsils. So the tonsils then are these patches of lymphoid tissue or lymphatic tissue. And it's located where the nasal and the oral cavities are going to enter the pharynx. So lymphatic tissue located where the nasal and oral cavities enter the pharynx. So we have kind of our nasal cavities where we can breathe in, and we have a cavity in the nose area, and then the mouth, that's the oral cavity, and then they both go back and they join up back near the throat and then head down, and that's the pharynx where those two things meet up and other things are located there. So we have these patches of lymphatic tissue that are located in this region. And just as we discussed already with the malt, it contains lymphocytes and other leukocytes that are going to attack foreign cells. So contains leukocytes. And we have different groups of tonsils. So groups of tonsils. So we have our palatine tonsils. So we have a right and left palatine tonsil. And these are located in the posterior of the oral cavity, actually in the lateral margin. So the lateral margin. So lateral, right, not meaning the middle, but on the sides, the lateral margin of posterior, right, toward the back, oral cavity. So the space in the mouth, so toward the back of the mouth region, toward the throat. And these are most often infected. So these are the ones that are most often infected. And so these are the ones that are actually moved quite often in a tonsillectomy. Tonsillectomy. And then we have our lingual tonsils. Also right and left. So as the name implies, lingual is related to tongue, so it's embedded in the posterior portion of the tongue. And then we have the pharyngeal tonsils. And these are embedded in the posterior wall of the nasopharynx. So again, we're kind of talking throat region. And so they're in the posterior, so the back side of the wall of the nasopharynx. So the posterior wall of nasopharynx. So nasopharynx, naso meaning related to the nasal cavity. So it's the very, very back, toward the back of your head, nasopharynx. And then if this becomes enlarged, It's called an adenoid. So oftentimes people will say, oh, let's get your adenoids out, or your adenoid tonsils need to be taken out. These are actually technically called the pharyngeal tonsils, but when they become infected and enlarged, they call them adenoids. So then they will be removed. So the two that are most often removed are the palatine tonsils and the adenoids, or the pharyngeal tonsils. The lingual tonsils don't tend to be as much of an issue. And that, of course, is because it's not related to breathing. It's not in the oral cavity, or it's not in the nasal cavity causing problems with breathing. So the way that the tonsils work is actually, they're kind of these lymphatic tissue, and then when we look at them, they actually have these things called crypts in them, which are these indents. So if food is coming in this way, food and drink is coming this way, it's going to go down the throat. Let's say this is the throat here. It's going to go down and go into the stomach. What happens is a little bit of this food, a little bit of the food or fluid is going to get stuck in these crypts of the tonsil. This is our tonsil here. And then what happens is the tonsil is basically kind of testing our food and testing our drink for anything that we don't want in the body. So if it detects something like a bacterium or a virus or something like that, then it's going to start building up an immune response, because again, it has these lymphocytes and other leukocytes in there, and they're going to attack these foreign cells. So not only are they going to be kind of a first line of defense, where if we're drinking something or eating something that has bacteria in it, if that bacteria gets stuck in the tonsils, then it will get rid of it right away. And then it will also send out a response saying, this is what the bad guy looked like, let's all be on the lookout for this. And it's the first spot where we can start sending that out. So it's kind of a little taster of everything that we've got going into the mouth, even breathing. When we breathe in, that air is going to be flowing past those tonsils, and it's going to be picking up on any bacteria or viruses or anything that's going to be entering the body, and it'll be a first line of defense. So that summarizes our lymphatic system. We have our lymphoid organs that we just finished up there with the tonsils. So we talked about the different functions of the lymphatic system, the 3 different functions there. We talked about the structure. So remember, there are 2 kind of semi-independent parts, which are the lymphatic vessels, and then the lymphoid tissues and organs, which we just finished up. And then we also have lymph fluid flowing through those, through the vessels anyway. We talked about lymph fluid, how we get lymph, how it works with the lymph capillaries. We talked specifically about the vessels and how we move the lymph up to the subclavian veins. Remember, the lymphatic system does not have a pump. We talked specifically about the lymph node, and then we talked about the other lymphoid organs, the spleen, the thymus gland, the mucosa, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT, and then the tonsils specifically. So that summarizes our lymphatic system.